Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. Today, our special guest is Michael Shonka, and Michael is all the way in Nebraska, and Michael has a lot more solar experience than most people. I'm looking at his LinkedIn page right now. 42 years, 1983. Wow. I'm just thinking what I was doing in 83, and it probably wasn't something that I'd want to admit to. I was in high school, probably hiding from the vice principal, doing something that I'm not supposed to do. And there you were, saving the planet. And so back in 83, what was going on there, Michael? Was it like the solar thermal experience? Was it those rebates and stuff for solar thermal? Was that happening?
Yes, it was. Incentives were happening at the time. In Nebraska, we not only had the 40% federal, but we also had a state rebate of 30%.
And those rebates were all for solar hot water, is that right?
Solar hot water and air systems. So you can't forget the orphan air systems.
Okay. And you said a 40% rebate.
That was the federal tax incentive at the time.
Uh-huh. Was it a rebate or?
No, it was a tax credit. It was a tax credit.
40%, I guess you could call it an ITC, investment tax credit?
Yeah, pretty similar to that. Applicable, similar rules as today, applicable to both residential and commercial. And then also we had a state 30% tax credit for state. And our state tax bill was pretty minimal compared to the federal, so didn't really have that much of an impact. But when you're thinking, that's quite a bit of an incentive and very progressive for our state. Our state isn't known to be out in front of those kinds of things, but we had a few legislators that were aware of the importance and worked very hard to pass the bill with some industry help. And it was just really an interesting time. We had similar events too, but today, as far as marketing such goes, but basically solar thermal was predominantly hot water and then also air. So air wasn't quite eliminated. It was very much part of that solar era at the time because our climate matches up very well with space heating requirements. And we get a lot of clear sun in the winter time.
Mm-hmm. Nebraska?
Yeah, in Nebraska, we will actually get quite a bit of enough for daytime space heating that the furnace just won't come on until into the evening after the sun goes down.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to even think about what was happening back in 83. So was it like 80 when Reagan got elected? I think.
Yes, Reagan had the option of extending the solar tax credits and chose not to, despite intense solar lobbying. And really what happened at that point is a lot of companies, reading the tea leaves, basically planned a bankruptcy as their exit strategy. And the solar industry quite literally collapsed overnight. It just went away. You know, people had some projects, of course, to finish up, but that was about the end of it.
Yeah, I guess he was elected in 80. He must have been sworn in on J6, 1981, January 6, 1981. Went all the way until 89. I guess that would have been the 88 election where Bush Sr. got in there for 4 years.
Yes.
And so, yeah, Carter was famous for being in there in the office during the energy crisis and starting the solar industry with his solar hot water, solar heating and stuff like that. And so it's kind of interesting that you got in 83. And I guess, was it that Carter's incentives, that 40% tax credit, didn't expire yet in 83?
No, it expired at the end of 85.
Okay.
And that's when Reagan didn't extend it. And that's when the industry ended. Correct.
Do you remember the day that Reagan took the solar off of the White House?
I actually don't. We're a little bit insulated here in Nebraska from a lot of events. And back then, if you weren't watching the Chet Huntley, David Brinkley report, you didn't quite catch the news.
You didn't see it on Instagram or something?
Yeah. Right. So that may have even been more of a quiet event than a
Yeah.
lot of people realized when they were removed. I didn't learn of it until some years later, frankly.
Do you know those tax credits? Was it just for solar heating or was it also PV, even though PV was super, super expensive?
No, there wasn't any recognition, I believe, for PV at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's interesting. We have this movement now of solar pioneers, and it's all focused on PV because PV is what everybody thinks solar is. And it's almost totally ignored solar thermal, which I'm
Mm-hmm.
sorry to say, but solar thermal had a much more important role to play in our US economy at that time period than PV did. I did 3 PV jobs at the time, and they were all for islands in the Caribbean.
Wow.
It was little Arco panels hooked up to batteries with a tiny little charge controller and running 12-volt lighting.
Awesome. So you said these little Arco, and then how did you even learn to do it back then?
Oh, a lot of research. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the internet was not there.
Mm-hmm.
So you would contact the companies, and
Like real goods or something?
I don't think I went through that one. I can't remember if it was Solex or some other company that was there at the time. But, none of them exist anymore. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, they're all gone.
And which three islands?
I don't know. I assembled the equipment and instructed the guy on how to use it, and he installed it.
Oh, so you didn't go there? You'd put it
No,
together
no,
and
uh-uh,
send it out. Okay.
no.
Huh.
But I do recall it was pretty expensive for what
Mm-hmm.
I thought he was getting at the time. But that's just the gist of it.
Yeah, I don't know. What would it have even been back then? Like how many, what, $100 a watt or some kind of crazy
Yeah,
thing like
it
that?
was ridiculously
Uh-huh.
expensive. I remember when things were starting to crash through in the 19, or I'm sorry, in the 2010, '09, after the, I don't know, affectionately called the Asian invasion, we had a lot of drops in prices. Almost every order saw a decrease. And it was kind of phenomenal to experience that. Talk about solar coaster at the time. Reps were making quotes off of memory that were incorrect because the market had passed them by 20-30%. So every once in a while I'd have to say, could you consult your latest cost sheet, because I think that was like 6 months ago pricing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was an escalator ride right on down the price demand point. It was pretty amazing.
Uh-huh. So you must have been pretty young back then when you were.
I was post college, and it
Mhm.
was actually my father that got me interested in solar at the time. He was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about the future of solar and how our economy needs to shift that way, and such. And this was, again, the Wall Street at the time. And so we found a company in Michigan that looked to be pretty promising as far as the technology goes. And they had some very interesting, so we say, technological upgrades. And at that time, I try to stress with people that we were engaging an HVAC industry that still was working with pneumatics and little mercury bulbs and things. As an industry, we had to transition from plus or minus 5 degrees to plus or minus 1 degree on sensors. So when the digital differential controller came out, that was real revolutionary back then. I mean, that made the whole market.
And what again is this? The digital controller?
Sure. It's a digital differential controller, and you would put a sensor on the panel up above in the roof, and then you'd put a sensor inside the house or inside the tank for storage, and the two sensors would compare each other. So when the collector temperature was, depending on how you set it, either 8 degrees or maybe for a solar air system, 20 degrees in difference, then it would turn on the fan or the blower. So you had to have that difference of, anywhere from 10 to 20 degrees in order for the heat to be pushed into the residence. So that little device was plus or minus 1 degree, had a very high reliability rate. Whereas the other equipment, it wasn't quite the same in reliability and accuracy. And so it really changed it. And then you could also, with those controllers, they soon came out with multiple function controllers so that you could actually engage the furnace blower if you wanted to push heat from the solar hot water tank into the house through an air to water heat exchanger that you put into the furnace. And these are all kind of almost like a lost art now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I deem it really important that we learn these lessons or relearn these lessons so that they're not forgotten, because they're very practical lessons to learn and still applicable today. When you're looking, I'm presenting a paper in a few weeks to the Architects Engineers Institute on how solar thermal can be incorporated into new building construction. And we could literally be building structures off grid. There isn't any reason to tie in to the grid with our current levels of PV, and incorporating solar thermal with radiant floor heat, a good high performance building, and passive solar. Those four attributes gives you an off-grid building comparable to prices of conventional construction. So these are things we just need to relook at. And I find that I'm one of the few people that can integrate those ideas and be able to bring them forward to the market. So I thought, well, the best thing to do is try to get that out there and write a paper for the architects and engineers to review.
Yeah, I know that they say that solar thermal is way more efficient than PV, like PV are around 20%. And solar thermal, what is it like? It could be like 90% or something like
And
that.
not quite that, but you can easily attain 70 to 80% efficiencies with solar thermal.
Yeah, because even with like a lot of systems, the inefficiency is heat.
Yeah, or heat losses.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting that it's not, you know, how it just kind of got taken over by PV. I know that I'm the president of NorCal Solar now, which is an ACES chapter. And
Sure.
did I meet you through ACES? I'm trying to think of when I first met you.
Oh, we did meet, I think, in Boulder a couple of years ago, a
Yeah,
year or so ago.
at the ACES conference.
Yeah, there, and then other places along the way.
So do you know Elaine Hebert?
Sure.
So she's like been really active in ACES and NorCal Solar. And when they handed over NorCal Solar to me, one of the things that she was saying is don't forget about solar thermal. It's like always been an important part of ACES, and ACES founded in 1954. And I think back then it was just like mostly all solar thermal is what they were talking about.
Mostly passive solar, really, at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, just even like cooking your food with putting tinfoil on a little parabola, aiming it at your pot, or in that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Sure. And really, the lessons learned from the 80s, it was a real moon race of technology. It was unbelievably rapid acceleration when you look at it from here going backwards. But at the time, it was just you were adopting new techniques to employ on your installations. And fortunately, you don't really have to go back to previous installations and make changes because what you were using at the time had worked then. But there were just different ways of doing things. Like, for example, with the solar air systems, we learned early on to pull the cold air return to the collectors off the floor, because that would help with the circulation in the room. So when you set up, and we never integrated the solar air system into the furnace, just you would lose a lot of BTUs in the ductwork. So we would always try to improve the circulation inside the home by adding solar air and making sure that its thermal loop going through the house passed through the living spaces during the daytime. That would improve the comfort level of the home. So it was really an interesting set of attributes that you sort of learned over time. Yeah.
So what would one of these solar air systems look like? I mean, you're capturing air. There's like maybe like a piece of glass over something black, and you capture the air, and then you bring it into the building.
So what a solar air system looks like. I've been teaching classes at the community college and universities, and we have made solar air collectors in class. So the way we do that is we'll just take a sheet of patio glass. Now, normally I would use solar thermal glass, which is 92% light transmittant. ordinary window glass is in the low 80s as far as light transmittance. And if you put low E on it, it's even worse. So you really want sort of plain patio glass if you can get it. And then put a metal box that it fits on top of, insulate it with the polyisocyurate type of rigid foam insulation all the way around. You put a channel, essentially you create a separation point, a tiny little wall or something, if you will, between both halves of it. So you've got a long 4x8 sheet down the middle, you have a barrier so that air is forced to go all the way down one side, cross over, and come back all the way to the other side. And in that passage, the air will pick up 15 to 20 degrees of temperature. And we would build these in the class, and then we'd take them outside and stand them up and give them a couple minutes to warm up, and then basically turn on the blower. And the students were amazed at how much heat came out of this hollow box.
So you would usually use a fan instead of just the fact that heat rises?
Oh gosh, no, it's an active solar system. So you have to have energy to move the heat. And a blower unit is sized according to how much surface area you've got and the type of equipment and such. And so we would find, like, especially with longer duct runs, we'd have to double insulate the ductwork in the attic and do a lot of things that were just good technique practices in order to conserve the amount of energy that you had trying to get into the house.
I suppose just having a black curtain on a south-facing window
Helps.
would be a sort of a solar collector.
It is. Yeah, it would be, definitely. But trom walls in our climate don't work. So if you're familiar with that, the wall just gets cold and it never warms up.
And explain what that wall is.
Well, it's usually a wall, like a concrete wall, and then in front of it would be a glazing. And as the sun comes up during the day, it heats the wall up, and then that heat would transmit into the building, through the back side of it. Well, in our climate, when we get 3-4 days of cold with no sun, the trom walls just become a cold barrier into the house, and so they don't work. But a solar air collector standing vertically on that same place would always provide heat and not be a negative for cold air. So that always would work well with our climate. As a matter of fact, the last of the solar manufacturers for solar air collectors, the last one that they made was up in Minnesota. And I literally bought the collectors in the showroom as their last of the collectors that they had at the time. Yeah.
So they don't even make them anymore.
A lot of manufacturers are gone, and I'm sorry, I haven't checked to see if anybody is still making them. It would be sad to say, but I do have a couple of models that I've purposely have preserved in case the time ever comes again that we would start making solar air panels, which I think is relevant given climate issues that have been arising at this time.
Sure. And I'm even wondering too, like going back to the 80s, you got your start in 83. Were people doing solar probably for all different reasons, but was it more of a, energy crisis thing where energy was just expensive and we didn't want to depend on foreign oil? Or was it an environmental thing, or was climate change even a thing?
Yeah, you raise an interesting point thinking back at that time. It's about the same as it is today. About 50% of the motivation was to save money, because in 1 year alone, we had a 35% increase across the country in natural gas pricing. So that was a price shock that went through the economy. So there was definitely a motivation to conserve your own personal wealth.
What a concept.
Yeah, there was another one where, well, we got to do this for the environment too. Although climate change and associating the whole ethos to a color with a single syllable didn't really come together. We didn't have green at that time. It was just solar. So the marketing hadn't really caught on in a lot of different social levels. But it was important to people, and they did feel like they needed to contribute some kind of solution themselves as well as save money. So I find that is pretty much nip and tuck today, where the same motivations are relevant to the consumer.
Yeah, I'm not sure back then if, all the graphs with CO2 and climate change, there was a lot less of that happening. And maybe the environmentalists were more thinking of, smokestacks and asthma and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's the case also. We didn't have a lot of the nomenclature that we have today, or nor the concepts, so that it was, in a sense, more simplistic. And then with the solar tax credit being fairly prominent, you had a number of people who had sufficient funds were more willing to participate because they would get the money back. It was like investing in their own property to a certain extent. So, and interesting too, we didn't have HOAs that said you couldn't put it on.
Mm-hmm.
That came later. And here in Nebraska, we're one of the few states left that still prohibits solar in a lot of HOA areas, which is, in my mind, a real antiquated rule that needs to be changed, at least on our state level. But it was just a different time, and there were a different set of motivations, but some things are still consistent today.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I guess too, like there was 3 Mile Island in '79.
Yeah, that was right. So the interest of our nuclear industry was quite challenging that way, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, and then I guess there was the hostages in Iran, and a lot of oil coming from that part of the world. So just trying to remember where the consciousness was at those times.
Yeah.
Besides me getting in trouble in high school.
Yeah, there you go. So moving forward, the industry collapsed in 85. It was the last year. It was a really big year. It was actually achieved $1 billion in revenue for solar, which was a big number back then. So it was huge. And just like solar, the solar electric today, the parallels were quite astounding. We learned how to do residential, and then we started doing commercial. And then we started doing these large scale projects. And one of the largest was in Wisconsin with a meat packing plant. And they
Mm-hmm.
had this enormous solar hot water system. And then the engineers had to learn how to handle these large volumes of solar collectors. And they soon found out that things turn to steam if you don't keep the water going. That's a problem because you don't want to create steam inside of a flat plate collector. So they had to redo some of these large scale systems because they literally didn't know the parameters that they're dealing with at the time. So it was a constant learning experience, particularly the last couple of years as they tried to scale up on the utility and commercial operations. And again, those lessons need to be relearned too before they have to be repeated because large scale solar process hot water, if you call that, is something that has a great value today and is much more efficient to run with solar thermal than it ever would be with
Uh-huh.
PV.
Yeah.
So those lessons are still relevant in our current market.
So I just saw you not too long ago at the NABCEP conference, and there
Yes.
was a speaker that was Senator, I think, Donate from Las Vegas, and he was talking about unethical solar sales and stuff like that. And I know right now Heat Spring has a class on ethical solar sales, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a huge topic because the solar industry is kind of getting a bad reputation for ethics and sales. And I remember hearing some people saying that there was that same problem back in the day with people selling solar thermal systems that didn't know what they were doing and causing leaks on the roof and making hot water leak into a house and never, in the middle of the summer when it wasn't raining because they got water on a roof and they make the holes right and it leaks. So do you remember any of that? Was that going on too? Was there some bad actors? There's always bad actors in every industry, I guess.
Yeah, right. And they'd have to say that there's 95% doing a good job.
Uh-huh.
And then there's the 5% that really need to be behind bars. So what we had at the time, and you have to remember, Nebraska in the middle of the country, we're 5 years behind any coast. Just pick a coast, and we're 5 years behind it. You
Mhm.
know, in all kinds of attributes.
Okay, I'll
So,
pick the North Coast up towards the North Pole and
yeah,
northern
right.
Canada.
Yeah,
You can't be
right.
behind that.
No, not
They're
too much.
probably like, having some seal blubber there or something.
So, you know, we had a really good local markets and everything was much more local then. So I actually had bringing equipment in by the semi-load, and we have like a 5-state dealership network. And I was literally teaching classes. Here I am in my 20s, just a kid, a few years out of college, but I learned quickly. And I ended up with a lot of practical experience getting OJT from the manufacturer of the equipment.
On the job training?
You bet. And, I was the squirrel they put up in the attic to run the ductwork because most of the other guys couldn't fit. So you learn all these things and fairly rapidly. And then in medicine, they say, watch one, do one, teach one, is kind of where we're at. And we had to get people up to speed in the field to do this technology, and it was pretty quick. Now, what happened on the coastal areas was in many ways missed here because we have a certain sort of work ethic that the Midwest, I still think, has above other parts of the country, where you got to live with what you do, and you better do it right the first time because you don't want to have to come back to fix mistakes. So we would install our equipment, and no, we didn't have leaks. Our air duct systems were sealed and insulated well, so they performed. So a lot of those things we missed. But in 85, a number of new companies started to call me, and they were moving into a market. They wanted to know if I want to do installations for their products. And I'm a little reluctant, but yeah, I'll entertain the notion. What you rapidly find out is that they have absolutely no concept of the Midwest market or what it's like. And solar is local. There are practices that you'll do in one part of the country and not do in another. So when they arrived, there wasn't much you could really do with them because they had this marketing plan, they had their lead generation programs, they had all these things. It's all carbon copy of the Time magazine article that came out in 23 of how the solar sales bros threaten the green energy transition.
Mhm.
That title is pretty massive. And we
Yeah.
had that experience. Matter of fact, one of the companies that exit strategy was bankruptcy was Servomatic Solar. And you can still see some of their lawsuits listed online, even. The company was well funded. And when it was in the home, they had a whole process. It's like a 15-step process of the presentation. And at every point, the homeowner was to nod their head and get an agreement, yes, yes, yes. So at the very end, signing up was just another yes. So they wrote paper in the home. And in the finance parlance, it's called non-recourse paper. So this non-recourse paper means that we can easily graph this to you. You'll pass it, even if you have a relatively modest credit score. We can get you funded. You can get the system installed next week. Of course, and the 3 day of rescission was just getting into vogue at that time. So a lot of people just didn't know they even had the option to refuse. But the installation would go in, and maybe the crew was doing 1 or 2 installations a day of this type of equipment. It was not the best. The equipment was not very durable. And a lot of times the homeowners, after a period of a couple of years, would have a service call issue and they wouldn't know who to call. Well, they soon found out non-recourse paper means that you don't have to pay it, basically. If you're non-performing on your agreement as the vendor, that homeowner doesn't have to pay. And it almost brought household finance down into bankruptcy because of so many people in California, particularly, stopped paying their solar installments due to lack of service in the industry. So we're going full circle. The same kind of marketing techniques, according to the Time Magazine article of the solar sales bros, we're doing the exact same things over again. And in my state, the electrical division put a pause on what was then SunPro at the time. It later got sold to ADT and then wound it down. But that company was not able to install any more systems until they cleaned up all their problems with it. And we have a current sales system being, I think, exploiting people with another company here that's still viable. I'm not sure exactly how, but they're charging over $5 a watt typically, where mine is $3 a watt. So their cost points are much higher, and it's masked when you look at the loan system, but they're actually, people in many cases are upside down on the loan because we only have 10-cent electric. They're never going to recover their investment. It's unfortunate. Yeah.
We need to figure out some way to like self-police the solar industry and go after those so-called solar bros that are out there conning people and, you know.
Right. And it's different levels. I mean, you get an aggressive sales guy, and if he's only paid per sale, straight commission, that's what you're going to get. But if their salespeople are actually paid, a living wage salary, and then the bonus is getting sales, that's a different story. That's a different animal altogether. And you don't prey on people as much. And so the stories that the Las Vegas senator was talking about, they live on all over the country. I've seen it here. It's an absolute carbon copy of things 40 years ago. It's just human behavior getting away with things that aren't ethical. And you're right. As an industry, I'm doing what I can, alerting our state attorney generals to sales practices. And, I've never seen solar electric on the north side of a house before. Never. And I saw first couple of systems here this last few years, and I'm appalled that people would do that.
Well, I mean, I've done it, but that's when the south side is filled up and you get about 2/3 of the electricity in most parts of the U.S. Or take the old system, put it on the north, and rather than throwing it away. But yeah, especially it doesn't make sense at all, like where the electricity is inexpensive, like where you are, like you're saying 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That would be a losing proposition.
Yeah. It's very marginal that it'll pay back to start with. And then if you add interest rates on top, there's no hope of recovery of the initial investment.
Yeah.
So, most all of my customers are cash customers, and that's the way it's always been out here. And until we see higher revenues or higher rates, that's probably the way that it's.
And we have to look out for those really stupid Australian people. They keep putting it on the north side of the roof there too.
Yeah, a little thing about that equator, it kind of flips.
Yeah, we need to educate them. And some other things that you mentioned too was like you said something about the 3-day. And so I think in a lot of places with contracting in general, people get 3 days to cancel the contract. Like they sign something and you get 3 days. So let's just let people know, spread the word. You get 3 days to cancel.
And I've actually had people call me up. It's kind of like buyer's remorse. Am I doing the right thing? I remember distinctly one gentleman called me up and he signed an $80,000 contract for, I think it was like a 12K system. And I was stunned. I'm not doing a very good job on my website if I can't educate people, at least that much. So we got him out of the contract. I measured the roof. Well, part of the roof was pointing north, so you can't put solar panels there. And we were able to get it to an 8K system, and I got it to him for under $20,000, which is much better to the market.
Yeah.
That's
a huge difference.
It was huge. And that was the kind of thing that's been going on here, because of this solar sales bros activity, that it's really hard for our state's attorney general to catch up. They have a lot of things to catch up on, not just solar. But when it's an egregious situation like that, taking advantage of people who really, in some cases, are just susceptible to home sales, you got to watch out for your own.
I was thinking about making a class to educate consumers, just to tell them like what a kilowatt hour is and, maybe a little bit about price per watt, some kind of range for that and how to look out for those solar bros.
Well, let's don't bring the whole industry down with it, but I just did a class last night. It's a 3-hour class at the community college, and the people there were, interestingly enough, I didn't have any off-gridders this time. It was just all rooftop solar. And we went through all those numbers. I'm very upfront. This is your cost of equipment. This is your cost of labor. This is your final price is around $3 a watt for small systems. It goes down for farmers, which are doing larger scale systems, but that's a fair price to you. And if you get higher than that, you need to be aware and know why. But that's only a handful of people at a time, and you need to do the masses. So that effort really becomes more of, public marketing, public relations kind of effort. It's hard for an industry that's as small as we are to do that kind of marketing.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Shaun White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. So are you still doing solar thermal? Like, do you get calls or do you have solar hot water customers?
I do. And my latest kind of market pitch, because I go to the state fairs as an exhibitor, and I'm an exhibitor and a speaker at a lot of different of the ag market associations in their state. I do get some solar thermal, and I've tied it to radiant floor heat because that's what makes the most sense. The water heaters today are much more efficient than they were in the 80s. And so you don't really have the benefit of hot water on a residential. That market is long gone. But you do have space heat. We're in a 6,600 heating degree day climate here in the Midwest and 8,000 up in North Dakota and Minnesota. So space heating is very important and 6-8 months out of the year issue. So we're looking here at radiant floor heating for a lot of the new construction, and especially in the ag markets. Farmers are building their own shops now, and they have to pour about 6 or 8 inches of concrete because of the heavy equipment that goes in. And so it's really going to be a sturdy structure over a long period of time. And I'm trying to educate them as to the benefits of hydronic heating. So I'm sort of like shifting hats a little bit. So I'm from the electric guy over to a radiant floor guy, and then tie that into solar, because the benefits of the tax credit follow you through that construction process. Your heat distribution is your floor, and that's a benefit. Then your boiler becomes your backup unit, and it will come on during periods of no sun. But for the most part, they're not trying to heat up a lot of their shops to 75 degrees during the winter. They're lucky if they get it to 55 or 60. That's what they want, a comfortable temperature to work in. And that's usually the case. But with solar thermal, you get the tax credits all the way through. And how else can you heat a building with the equivalent of a couple 100-watt light bulbs? I mean, it's an amazing amount of heat coming from a very low energy requirement of a circulator pump.
So I know for solar thermal, a lot of times they'll use a big tank for heat storage, but with radiant floor heating, I guess would it just be the slab of concrete that's the energy storage?
You still need a buffer tank. And so you'll still need a few hundred gallons at least of a buffer tank. But again, that can be an atmospheric tank. It doesn't have to be an IAPNO certified pressurized tank.
So what does that mean then? Atmospheric tank and pressurized tank?
Sure. So an atmospheric tank is literally, think of it as, say, a freezer chest where you have a cover over it and you've got some coils of pipe running into it. And so it's an insulated box. And it may be, chest high, 5 feet tall. It's good to get it taller because you'll get stratification. So that kind of a tank you can make.
So are you just making your own tanks?
Usually, yeah.
Huh. Wow.
And I've come up with a couple of really nice designs that could be mass produced more. And so here we are. Yes, we could be manufacturing these kinds of tanks locally or at site. And you don't have to have the designations that a pressurized tank will have, which is all kinds of certification tests and all that. It's just an atmospheric tank.
Why wouldn't you just use the slab for the energy storage?
You can, but you need to buffer the temperature. Coming off of solar, that's an irregular temperature. It's unpredictable. You get some bright sun, you'll come out with 180-degree water. You got cloudy day, you've got 120-degree water. Well, your slab only needs 90-degree water, 105 tops.
What happens if it's too hot for the slab? It'll burn your feet.
Well, it's not real good for the PEX will take it.
That's the tubing, like plastic.
That's the tubing. Yeah, it's an elastomer tubing that goes in there. But it's not good for the PEX, and it's not good for the concrete even. There's cases where concrete kind of exploded because of differential.
Okay, you talked me out of that.
Yeah. So you do need a buffer tank. It's just, there are ways of doing it without, but you need a mixing valve to do that appropriately. And what I found over the years is get this thing down to as simple a possible process. If you can get all the mixing valves out, better. If you have one, that's enough. But you want the system to operate routinely, uneventfully for decades of time. And to do that, you got to get as few controls as possible. And early on, the solar thermal days, a lot of engineers were designing these systems, and engineers love controls. I mean, they got to control everything. They're control freaks, right? So, hey, it would break down, and then nobody knew how to fix it. There's no clue because they didn't come with a Bible, They just were there. So you had to understand how the system works. And a lot of times you can't count on the homeowner or the property owner to know anything. And certainly a plumber coming up there, he's not even used to a circulator pump because everything he does is city water pressure. So this is a totally foreign experience for him. And then they don't want to do it. So you end up with orphan systems out there. And this is the kind of thing where you keep it simple as much as possible, and then the product just works forever. There's no callbacks, there's no service. It's just works forever.
So where do you get your collectors?
Solar hot water collectors are still being made in the US. There's a really good company, Sun Earth, out in California, and those guys are a wealth of information. I've forgotten more stuff than those guys just have encyclopedic information. So great spot to start. Home Power Magazine, my good buddy Chuck Markin, who passed away a couple of years ago, a few years back. Chuck had written a number of solar thermal articles. He's one of my influences early on when I got started with solar. Came into my shop at one time and we bought some of his equipment. So the resources are still out there. They're just a little bit archived.
Yeah, like Home Power Magazine, Solar Pro Magazine, they stopped making those in 2018, but you can still go on the website and download them all.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I tell my students all the time when they're asking me. I says, well, read up on this article. That's perfect for you to read up on and educate yourself about
And then you have a solar class, so we can all go to Nebraska and take your class?
No. Yeah. We actually have a solar lab that was designed with the grant funds. I designed that back in 2009. It was built at the community college. The solar lab is about 1,000 square feet, maybe a little more. It has radiant floor heat tied to solar hot water. It's got both on-grid and off-grid PV. And then we did a couple of novel things. I mean, we did some passive solar lights or passive solar windows, so there's solar gain during the day. I researched what plants like, and they like a certain kind of color range to be reflected off of the floor. So we dyed the concrete kind of a reddish color So that actually helps with the hydroponic systems. And then we made a solar air collector out of the garage door.
Hmm.
So the garage happened to be pointing south, and why not?
Hmm.
And so we made a solar air collector out of the garage door, and during the daytime, when the sun's out, the garage door produces warm air.
No, cool. Awesome. Yeah, and I know that HeatSpring has some solar thermal classes, and one of them is by a guy whose book I read a long time ago, Bob Ramlow. Do you know him?
I know, Bob. Yes.
Yeah.
I actually work with or use his book in some of my solar thermal classes. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember I read that book too, so I could get my solar contractor's license in California. I know at least at the time it was like a lot of solar thermal stuff in there. And
Hmm.
one of the things that I remember from that book that I thought was pretty cool is I think it was called a high mass solar thermal system. And I think it was like underneath the slab, there was like a bunch of sand and he
Yes.
ran pipes through it. And then you'd heat it up months ahead of time
Yes.
to really hold lots of heat for a long period of time. I thought that was cool. Like, I think as soon as you could handle more heat in the house, you would start heating up this.
About the end of August is
Yeah,
when
and
it
you
started.
leave your windows open and everything so you don't get the house too hot and you start heating it up and then, it can last all winter long.
Yeah, that technology was more novel than practical. The cost of doing that, and also you couldn't have dry sand. You had to have a certain moisture content in the sand. So that was basically, I won't say it was debunked, but it was found to be a less desirable construction practice than using radiant floor heat with the PEX tubing. And the reason radiant floor heat, it's more readily adaptable and you can fine tune the temperature application a little better. It still has a lag time to it. And I attended numerous sessions where I learned from the owners of these homes. And several of them said, well, if I was going to do it over again, I'd probably just do radiant floor heat. And I go, I didn't think it was real practical. However, there may be practical uses for it in large industrial applications or something like that. I don't know. But it is being used, I know, in Norway, Sweden, and Finland up in that area for some construction. They're doing superheated sand as a storage medium for thermal. Yeah. So it is being used. And I think they probably by now have figured out some of the nuances to it. But for ready home construction, even light commercial, it was an interesting technology for sure. Had a lot of promise, just didn't prove out on the actual construction side of it.
So, if there's some people listening that want to try doing solar thermal that have never done it, what would be your advice?
Ouch. Okay, well, start small.
Hmm. Uh-huh.
You know, solar, let's take them apart. Solar air system is really, really simple. I would say start with that
Uh-huh.
because it's just running ductwork. But you need to understand that you got to double insulate the ductwork in the attic because the attic is in an unconditioned space. And so you're going to run the vents through the ceiling and you're going to get the air off the floor. And you're going to put your controller sensor inside the collector, etc. So you're going to use a lot of silicone to seal up the ductwork. You've just got to do that. You can't have leaks. And you can't use zip ties to do it because zip ties break over time. So it's got to be sealed. It's got to be screwed. You got to be very conscientious about it. But it's very simple. And you can actually do solar air right up against the wall and just pipe it through the wall. And then you don't have to run a lot of ductwork.
And
So
so, where would they buy some of this equipment, like Sun Earth that you were mentioning?
yeah, I would talk to them and see who's available, if anybody yet, for solar air collectors. And if not, build your own. Solar air is simple enough to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Build your own.
And what's a good resource for learning how to build your own solar air?
Builditsolar.com
Builditsolar.com.
has a number of projects in that space. That's really good. And then, of course, old issues of Home Power Magazine.
Great.
And then really old issues, which you'll never find, of Rodale Press.
Uh-huh. Well, that's kind of neat. Make your own solar. That's pretty cool. Talk about made in America.
There you go. And then for the solar hot water systems, you need to have some blowtorch experience. You really do. And that's
Like
very
plumbing,
helpful.
I guess. Is
Yeah,
that like getting the
plumbing.
copper pipes soldered
Yes.
together, all that kind of
Yes.
stuff?
Right. And you can't use PEX in the solar loop. That's just a no-no. You can use them for the floor, but you can't use it in the solar loop. That's got to be copper. I've had time and time contractors wanting to use PEX because it's rated for it, et cetera. It's, hell no. It's full stop. And then you got to put in your right safety valves and all those kinds of things. And again, there's articles in those locations for those kinds of projects.
Are there any particular brands that are more popular that are still active today
Not that I'm aware of,
for,
really.
for doing the hot water?
No.
There's one brand that they were in Richmond,
There is a
California.
brand that's in the East Coast that still makes heat exchangers. The problem is the heat exchangers need to be much larger than what you're using for boilers. Heat exchangers are typically going to be 10 square feet. That is inadequate for solar. Boiler temperatures are going to be 160, 180 degrees. Your solar hot water temperature may be 100 to 120 on a good day in the winter. So you need twice as much heat exchanger. So it's almost better to just use a regular tank, adapt it to solar, and use external heat exchangers so that you get adequate surface area to change that lower delta T temperatures. And that's really critical because if you don't have enough heat exchanger, doesn't matter how many panels you got up, it's just not going to work.
Okay. And then I'm just looking at the Sun Earth website that you mentioned. I
Cool.
recognize their logo from lots of bumper stickers.
Right, right.
And they do have some manufacturers of these, solar thermal collectors there. And then there's this solar swimming pool collectors. And do you have much experience with those?
I do have some experience with those, and that's basically taking a valve, inserting it after the filter, pushing some amount of water up to, say, the roof, and then you have this like black plastic pipe that you usually just glue down to the roof. And the water diverts through that and then comes back like 10 degrees warmer. And you're using large volumes of water with a low delta T on pools. But over the course of the day, that pool will heat up.
Yeah. And I've heard that the solar pool is a pretty good ROI, return on investment.
It does.
And it's like you're only using it in the summer or something. Pools lose a lot of heat from evaporation.
Yes, they
And
do.
even in Arizona, it's kind of crazy where it's like 110 degrees. The pool will be kind of cold. And then you can get these collectors, as you say, low delta T. So that means that it's not going to work in the winter. But you're not going to go swimming in the winter, right?
Well, yeah, not with that design of a collector. I have done systems where we used an ordinary flat plate collector, we ran it down to a tank, and then we put a heat exchanger in the tank that went to the pool, and another heat exchanger in the tank that went to the HVAC system. And so during the summertime, you would have a large number of collectors producing a hell of a lot of BTUs that you'd have no use for going to the pool.
Great.
And
Okay.
then again, you just need a large tank.
Sort of like a dump load in the thermal
It was a dump
business.
load,
Yeah.
exactly what it was. And so now you got year-round use of your large-scale solar hot water system rather than just, for the thermal part of the year. So that is an actual design that makes a lot of sense. And of course, you'll get a tax credit on that because your primary heat requirement is going to be the space heating. But you actually get a residual value to it because you'll be able to use it for solar hot water heating of the pool during the summertime. And then also one thing to keep in mind is solar PV differs very greatly in attitude, tilt, azimuth from solar thermal. Solar thermal in our climate, we needed things at 50 to 60 degree tilt pointed straight south or maybe 30 degrees of south. And you wouldn't want to make a solar thermal panel parallel to the roof because it will create steam during the summer. It can't help it. You've got to have that panel standing upright so that it acts like a smaller panel during the summertime when the sun is high overhead. And then it's full on during the wintertime when you really need it.
Yeah, there's no net metering with solar thermal, huh?
No, there's not.
So you can't take that summer energy and then use it in the winter.
And your pop-off valves will only work so well up to a
Hmm.
point, and then they'll fail.
Okay, great.
So yeah, there's a little nuances to it, and so I would encourage anybody that's interested in solar thermal to do a lot more investigation before they jump in and maybe try a little bit as a learning experience first. It's just a little complicated. Have a
Great.
friendly plumber.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Seriously, a guy that wants to learn about that would be a wealth of help.
Yeah, and then also people that are trying to work with flow batteries, they could do solar thermal because it's all about plumbing.
Sure, sure. Interesting thought. Hadn't
Hmm.
crossed over on that,
Yeah,
but makes sense. Wow.
great. Okay. Let's see. Is there any other things that you want to cover, Michael?
Well, I just wanted to say one thing that when it comes to the Midwest market, we're different than the rest of the country. And wherever you are in solar, you've got to adapt to your local market. But here, there are some things that are obviously parallels, like rooftop solar to a certain extent. But we have an ag market. We're starting our community solar market, but it's lagging behind the EPCs on their large scale systems. And I think as the only public power state in the country where all of our generation distribution is by a public entity, we need to really work through the cultural change that's required by public power and incorporate more community solar here. There's a theory in telecommunications called costless telecommunications, where because of the infinite capability of fiber optics, you're able to actually use telecommunications at almost no cost. The cost of adding one more person to the network is so small you can't calculate it. Well, we have a similar thing with costless power. The concept being if the feedstock is no longer there, if we don't have to buy train loads of coal to make power, then our feedstock is free. So adding solar, once you cover the equipment cost, it's all free. And if you have community solar, that means people can take their money, invest it in an infrastructure to improve their neighborhood or their community. And then those revenues coming back are actually being turned around in the community rather than when we have coal based or fossil fuel based, those revenue dollars leave the state. So Nebraska has billions of dollars in trade imbalance because we're not a carbon state. We don't have any kind of fossil fuel here. So 95% of our energy in this state is imported, absolutely imported. That means 95 cents out of every energy dollar in this state is exported. That is a huge drag on our
Wow.
state's economy.
Hmm.
So we need to look more towards true community solar where the investment and return on investment goes to the participants in the community solar projects. That's the thing that I think as a country we also need to look at because those feedstocks are free. And we're not just robbing the general utility of its revenue. No, that's not it. We're going to have, as in, again, in telecommunications, that little router in your house is more switching power than most central offices did 10 and 20 years ago. That little guy is intelligence on the edges of a network. And it's just like what we have with the new inverters today, is they are able to react to the grid conditions in such a manner to stabilize the grid. So now we're pushing the intelligence of the power network to the edges, just like in telecommunications. So we don't depend as much on the central plant generation and substations as we can create this mesh network of inverters talking with each other, working with each other, as well as community solar projects where we're generating power locally and using it locally. I think those are the things that we need to work towards as an industry. And we need to, instead of look at huge, large scale utility systems, we need to start looking at more distributed generation, smaller scale, less than a megawatt. It'll fit in all kinds of places easily. It won't tax the capacity of the local lines. You won't have to rebuild infrastructure because of it, and it'll just work. And I think that's where we need to focus as an industry.
All right. Well, thanks, Michael, for being on the podcast.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Yeah, it was very fun to talk to you. And it seems like we have plenty to talk about, too. We could do this again sometime. And then also, I didn't mention it at the beginning, that Michael Shonka is the president of Solar Heat and Electric Incorporated out there in Omaha. You probably live next door to Warren Buffett, I guess.
He's actually just a couple miles over.
Oh, yeah. And I guess he's supposed to live in a modest house. Is your house nicer than his?
I'd say it's comparable. It's a little bit bigger house, but his is more of a Tudor style in keeping with the neighborhood.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's
And is his house something that you could just drive by, I guess?
Oh yeah. You could walk by it. You could. Yeah.
Does he have bodyguards out there and stuff?
Well, those guys have been learning to be a little more temperate with their ambition, you know.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, for a long time, people were cutting through his driveway because there's a little bit of a traffic barrier, and he had to put up a gate.
Okay,
So
well, that's
anyway.
pretty good and modest that
Yeah,
he
it is. It is.
lives in his same house that before he was rich, and now he's one of the richest billionaires in the world. You don't know him, do you?
I've met him on occasion. We're gifted in Nebraska with a lot of philanthropy. As a matter of fact, our philanthropic model is being used in other parts of the country now, where we have a private donations with leading and then public funding supplementing. And then through that guidance, we've created just incredible physical public structures in Omaha. We just opened this last year a whole new park with like 40 acres in downtown Omaha that just makes the city a wonderful place. So yeah, there's a lot of that in a lot of philanthropy, but we also are home of 5 different Fortune 100s. So,
Wow.
there's going to be some wealth here, but they keep it quiet. The guy, drives next to you in his car. It doesn't look any different than any other car, and could be a multimillionaire. You never know.
Yeah, my cousin does investments, and he makes the pilgrimage once in a while.
Sure.
I guess there's like the annual meeting
Yes.
for Berkshire Hathaway, and he tells me stories about going there and what it's like, and it's sort of like a pilgrimage.
It is.
It's like
It is.
it's almost like a religious thing.
Well, I wouldn't say it's quite that unless people are worshiping their money too much. But
Oh,
I would
sure they
say
are.
but it is kind of fascinating. The town really does get behind it, and we also get behind the College World Series. So we've had that for 40 years now, and I remember taking care of the mayor of Omaha who started the whole College World Series in our city, and it's growing dramatically. So yeah, the city's got a lot going for it. It's kind of a sleepy little burg. I wish it wouldn't get any bigger than it does, but anyway.
Well, I assume that probably somebody's going to call you soon to put some solar radiant heating on Warren Buffett's house. That's my prediction.
I don't think so. I don't think that'll be possible, but that's all right.
I think he probably needs it. Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you, Sean. I appreciate your time and interest, and I actually appreciate the service you're doing. Our communications and getting ideas across is one of the most important things I think we can do right now, especially in these times, so that we can help people understand where we are in the market, not just with solar, but with our energy consumption as a nation as a whole. And you're doing great work in that regard, and I really appreciate your efforts.
Thank you so much, Michael
You're welcome.
Shonka. And I imagine I might be seeing you at the ACES conference in August in Boulder, Colorado.
Yes.
And thanks for listening to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. In the show notes, we're going to put links to different places where you can learn about solar thermal and take solar thermal classes. And then you can go do a pilgrimage out to Omaha and take Michael Shonka's class at the college there. I think that's going to get really big, bigger than Warren Buffett's pilgrimage for Berkshire Hathaway. So,
Okay.
all right. Thanks a
Fabulous.
lot.